So I would, because I usually MC this event, but I'm honored to be the Thomas Aquinas speaker this year at our annual Thomas Aquinas event here, our lecture. One of the big things we do at Aquinas College is Thomas Aquinas Week, and it's always one of my favorite weeks of the year. And we were out there teaching in our academic robes today, and recalled, I don't know if my Waggy breakfast was one of the highlights of the week, but I had a good time going to Mass this Sunday and then going to the breakfast at Waggy afterward with students and parents and others. I'd also like to make just a few announcements about Catholic studies before I get into the talk. The first is that starting in the fall, we have a revision of the Catholic Studies minor. It's going to be 5 classes, one from a collection of history, philosophy, theology, literature, and art, very similar to the past, but much more choice for students. And now if you were a student, and speaking of Rome, Bob, where did Bob go? He already went home to take a nap. Are you here? Oh, there he is. And speaking of Rome, you could go to Rome now and get your Catholic Studies minor there simply by taking the classes there, coming back, taking one class, and you're done. So if the weather and the coffee and the architecture and the liturgies and everything else can encourage you to go to Rome, then maybe coming back with a minor will, at least, if you're a student. You can also, by the way, complete the bulk of the Catholic Studies minor now at the John Paul II Institute in Poland, another one of our Study Way programs. I think that would be, I go to Rome, the weather's better, but still Poland, pretty cool. So that's we'll leave that to free choice, what we want. So there are scholarships available for Catholic Studies. Catholic Studies funds student trips to Assisi. If you go to the Rome program, you get to go to Assisi, which is a side trip. It's usually not covered, but we cover it for students because we just don't want them to miss Assisi. Books are free for Catholic Studies students, thanks to our benefactors. So you're taking the Catholic Studies minors for the Catholic Studies classes anyway. You get your books paid for, and then also if you attend Acton University, you get to have quite a sizable scholarship known as the John Paul II Scholarship to be able to go to the semester in Rome. So we have a lot of things going on there. Our next speaker in the Catholic Studies Speakers Series, of which this is also part, is going to be May 21st. Most of the students are gone, but we still like to hold some good events at Aquinas. If somebody says, hey, would you like to have Peter Crafe come and speak again at Aquinas in May? The students are gone, but yes. So we don't want to pass up on Peter. So that's May 21st, if you want to put that down in your calendar. And finally, there was to be a book table in the back with books. And somebody just said, can I buy your book tonight? And I guess you can on Amazon, but the books didn't show up. But that's okay because I was paid up front for the book, so it's the publisher's problem at this point. So that's all right. Thank you, though. But it is an $8 book. It's why you can tell it's not an academic book because of the price, right? It'd be $800. So let me get started with the talk itself. The title is Catholicism, Liberty, and the American Experiment, and it is based on this new book of mine called The American Experiment in Ordered Liberty, where I primarily look at the founding of the country and try to discern on what kind of creed, if any, the United States was founded, and whether that means it was doomed to fail from the beginning and we should all despair and just walk right into the slough of despond and that kind of thing. And I think the answer is no, but anyhow, I want to explore that and explore the thinking, I think, of some insightful people over the past couple hundred years as to this question. And I'm going to start with Pope St. John Paul II, who at an American ballpark in 1995, it was Camden Yards, said America has always wanted to be the land of the free. Today, the challenge facing America is to find freedom's fulfillment in the truth, end quote. That question of freedom in truth and what to do with one's freedom had long been a special challenge for Catholic Americans. The United States of America was born in revolution during the Enlightenment, often speaking the languages of liberalism and Protestant Christianity at the same time. Even as popes condemned this liberalism and worried that religious liberty would encourage religious indifference, American Protestants argued that the Catholic faith was incompatible with democracy. St. John Paul was aware of this history when it came to American freedom and the Catholic faith, and in his short but profound homily, John Paul pressed further on what he meant by finding freedom's fulfillment in the truth. The question of this fulfillment had occupied two previous popes. One was Pope Pius IX, another was Pope Gregory XVI, both men of the early to middle 19th century, each of whom had, in specific contexts, condemned liberalism and condemned certain freedoms on which Americans place great value. Late in the 19th century, Pope Leo XIII condemned what he called Americanism, a censure that had a greater impact on European Catholics than it did on Catholic Americans. But John Paul had not come to Baltimore to condemn Americans, he had come to challenge them. And he said, quote, "We must guard the truth that is the condition of authentic freedom, the truth that allows freedom to be fulfilled in goodness." So to what sort of truth was John Paul referring? The truth, he said, that is intrinsic to human life, created in God's image and likeness, the truth that is written on the human heart, the truth that can be known by reason and can therefore form the basis of a profound and universal dialogue among people about the direction they must give to their lives and their activities. Sometimes, John Paul said, witnessing to Christ will mean drawing out of a culture the full meaning of its noblest intentions. A fullness, he says, it is revealed in Christ. Other times, witnessing to Christ means challenging the culture, especially when the truth about the human person is under assault. The question of how one ought to live is one of the oldest questions of mankind. John Paul appealed to President Abraham Lincoln to answer this question about how we ought to live together in a democracy. Because in a democracy, citizens have a role to play in determining, to play toward the common good and determining how to get there and what that might be. During the Civil War, Lincoln had argued that America's real roots were to be found in the claim that all men are created equal. So America did have a founding thought, Lincoln, and its most important founding claim, its creed, if you will, was to be found in Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. G.K. Chesterton, one of my favorite journalists, argues that Jefferson in the Declaration, quote, dogmatically bases all rights on the fact that God created all men equal. There is no basis for democracy except in a dogma about the divine origin of man, end quote. So it was in Lincoln's argument that St. John Paul found the answer for late 20th century American soul searching. And importantly, the answer turned out to be the same Christian anthropology proposed by the Catholic Church. Quote, President Lincoln's question is no less a question for the present generation of Americans. Democracy cannot be sustained without a shared commitment to certain moral truths about the human person and the human community. End quote. So John Paul reminded Americans, he said, look, he wasn't the first to say this and he won't be the last, that freedom consists not in doing what we like, but in having the right to do what we ought. The truths about the human person, and thus about the human community, that are present to some degree in the words of Jefferson and Lincoln, and if you want to know to what degree that is, I guess you'd have to read the book, but Jefferson, as you probably know, is not Roman Catholic, to say the least. But there's some interesting things I think I have to say in the book on Jefferson and the history of religious liberty in America. But they're present to some degree in the words of Jefferson and Lincoln, but they're seen at the fullest extent in Catholic social teaching. Catholic social teaching, as it is developed since Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum, is rooted in three assumptions about the human person and natural law. Thank you, Dr. Davis, for summarizing this for me, by the way, about Catholic social teaching. One of our theologians here on campus was a great help in the writing of the book. And the first is that the person has transcendent value. Number two, the second assumption about the human person and natural law, because of this, the good of the person cannot be subordinated to other goods. And finally, then three, it follows that social structures, governmental or otherwise, must either be ordered to this good or at least not interfere with it. Now, it'd be great if those 3 points were just easy and agreed upon, but it turns out the Catholic bishops have come up with 7 themes for Catholic social teaching. The difference between a theme and an assumption might be a whole different lecture. So you're not going to get that from me, but I'm going to tell you what their themes are. The first is life and dignity of the human person. I think it makes sense that they start with that. The call to family, community, and participation. Rights and responsibilities. If this was a student paper, I would have written vague in the margin by now, but I'm sure it's spelled out, right? Option for the poor and vulnerable. That's a little clearer. The dignity of work and the rights of workers. Solidarity, and then care for God's creation. Any list like this might imply equality among the teachings, but in fact there is a discernible moral hierarchy among them, descending from the Catholic understanding of the dignity of the human person. And then we have the compendium of the social doctrine of the church. Anybody ever taken a look at that? I'm a big fan of that, if you could be a fan of such a thing. That's the right word. Maybe fanatic, perhaps. But I've never been accused of that. The compendium gives 4 permanent principles, it calls them, of the church's social doctrine. The dignity of the human person, I sense a theme now in the right sense, the common good, subsidiarity, which it calls the fruit of democracy, and then solidarity. One fundamental point of Catholic social teaching, to quote the compendium, is, quote, that the coming of the kingdom of God cannot be discerned in the perspective of a determined and definitive social, economic, or political organization, end quote. Nor does the church offer a one-size-fits-all social democratic blueprint. In the words of John Paul II, this is from Centesimus Annus, since it is not an ideology, the Christian faith does not presume to imprison changing socio-political realities in a rigid schema. And it recognizes that human life is realized in history in conditions that are diverse and imperfect. Furthermore, in constantly reaffirming the transcendent dignity of the person, the church's method is always that of respect for freedom. So one of the purposes of my books was to say, look, especially to America's critics, especially her Catholic critics, that we need to recognize that the only authentic instantiation of the kingdom of God is heaven, and all else is to be sanctified and transformed by Catholics, working with and trying to expand what is well and good. So if the kingdom of heaven is not predicated on a definitive political organization, then wherein do we find the kingdom on earth? We find it, at least according to the compendium, quote, in the development of a human social sense, which for mankind is a leaven for attaining wholeness, justice, and solidarity, in openness to the transcendent as a point of reference for one's own personal definitive fulfillment. Has the American experiment over time allowed for us to do this? Certainly, it prefigured the Second Vatican Council in terms of religious freedom, and the recognition expanded over time that while religious freedom can indeed mask religious indifference, the latter is not the inevitable product of the former. The former, however, is required by the authentic understanding of the free human person contained in Catholic social teaching. Americans, for good or ill, have been among the least indifferent people when it comes to religion and the appeal to the transcendent as a point of reference. And if you've read the Missionaries of Republicanism book, which I do get royalties from, so I'll probably plug it a couple more times, that is all about kind of a history of anti-Catholic religious bigotry and its role in American identity, particularly in the 19th century and during the Mexican-American War. And so you don't want to take anything in my talk tonight to imply that Catholics have had a great experience in America where religious liberty is concerned over the long haul. On the other hand, well, we'll see. So, is the American liberal democratic order compatible with Catholicism and its social doctrine? That was the question I was given for the book. And I gave one of those kind of professorial answers. I said, well, it depends on what compatibility means, doesn't it? No political order is fully compatible with Catholicism or the Christian dispensation, but heaven, not even that great civilization called Christendom, which I love talking about in my humanities class here at Aquinas, that produced Dante, St. Francis of Assisi, and that other guy, St. Thomas Aquinas. Is that one familiar? Sounds kind of familiar. Okay, I ate some birthday cake yesterday, come to think of it. Another great Thomas Aquinas. Did you serve some cake? I bet you served. I thought I said they're serving. Okay, you get to volunteer to serve the cake. I don't do it because I have no willpower to, one for you, one for me, right? John Paul clearly found great promise in America and in its democracy and in its religious freedom and in the claims made by Lincoln regarding human equality. And I think he did so because he knew that to talk of compatibility with democracy is not to approve every decision the demos, the people, make. You can correct my Greek later, Daniel. John Paul also knew that, look, our freedom of the will does not mean that God approves every decision we make, does it? Neither was Thomas Aquinas making the case for anarchy when he argued that not everything that is immoral should be made illegal. Nor was he arguing for religious indifference in the Summa when he wrote of tolerating non-Christian rites, quote, either on account of some good that ensues therefrom or because of some evil avoided, end quote. Religious toleration was not the creation of Enlightenment liberals or of dignitatis humanae. It had a long heritage in the American colonies and in the early republic. It also was long a part of the Catholic tradition, even when not practiced. And as I show in the book, the first act of toleration in all the English colonies was in the Catholic colony of Maryland. It didn't work out so well for the Catholics there, but if you know that history. So as I explain in the book, the history of the United States played a key role in the development of the magisterial teaching on religious liberty that produced Dignitatis Humanae. The history of the United States marked a genuine development of human understanding that liberty, and religious liberty specifically, could play a preservative and stable influence on societal order rather than a destructive one. In the words of Dignitatis Humanae, quote, in order that relationships of peace and harmony be established and maintained within the whole of mankind, it is necessary that religious freedom be everywhere provided with an effective constitutional guarantee, and that respect be shown for the high duty and right of man freely to lead his religious life in society, end quote. The United States was not founded with a creedal blueprint drawn up by Enlightenment liberals indifferent to and skeptical of religion. There's a couple new books out there you might be interested in, one by Robert Wilkin on the history of liberty and religion, and another by Mark Hall on the founders of the United States and religious liberty, where he goes in among the founders, marked as and the framers, and you find out that lo and behold, they're not all deists. In fact, there's really just a couple. And that some of the most important deists, like Jefferson, of course, aren't even there to frame the Constitution, and yet, nevertheless, elsewhere played a significant role in the advance of religious liberty. So if it wasn't drawn up like that, well, where did it come from? Well, the freedom of religion in America developed as part of a long struggle for liberty and a lived experience with its blessings. It was an imperfect inheritance, eventually protected by the Constitution, then enhanced by practice, even while marred by the kind of violence and bigotry I describe in Missionaries of Republicanism. Quote, the American order was not founded upon ideology, writes Russell Kirk. It was not manufactured, rather, it grew. The Catholic Church gives no prescription for a political order for Christians. Christianity has flourished under deep oppression. Rome before 313, for example, speaking of Rome. And it has atrophied in states where crown and altar were unified, including in the papal states. St. Augustine argued that the true end of the city of man is the maintenance of peace and the perpetuation of justice on earth. As a good, this is in agreement with the highest good of mankind, the city of God. The state's most appropriate role is to ward against the various forces of destruction so that people might be free to reach their end in God. Quoting Augustine, this heavenly city, while it sojourns on earth, calls citizens out of all nations and gathers together a society of pilgrims of all languages, not scrupling about diversities in manners, laws, and institutions. It therefore is so far from rescinding and abolishing these diversities that it even preserves and adapts them so long as no hindrance to the worship of the one supreme and true God is thus introduced. So we now need to determine whether America really had a founding, and if so, what was its foundation? Was America doomed to fail from its inception because it had a hard founding rooted in a poisonous, false anthropology? In other words, do the culture of death and what Pope Francis calls a throwaway culture owe their existence not to human sin and the ascent of a post-Christian vision of progress, but rather to a small set of faulty ideas instantiated in the body politic by the Founding Fathers? Conversely, as the American bishops in the late 1800s and later John Courtney Murray argued, did the founders build better than they knew, drawing not on individualistic rights and Jacobin radicalism, that is, the radicalism, the anti-religious, death-dealing, culture-destroying radicalism of the French Revolution. That's what I mean by Jacobin radicalism. They did not draw on that for their creed, but rather on their own experience and a natural law, discernible through reason with clear links to the Catholic tradition. At least that's what the bishops and Murray thought. And then, of course, what if there was no hard founding at all? That is, no consciously wrought creed as such, but rather merely the preservation and codification of ancient traditions with links to classical and Christian worlds. Late 18th century America was a time when civic republicanism meshed healthily in tension with Christian teaching, with the desire for virtue, and nearly 2 centuries of English colonial experience. This is my clock. Okay. The United States was the first large republic since ancient Rome. Even as liberal revolutions during the 19th century repeatedly failed in Europe and in the Americas, the United States thrived, it prospered, it grew. It did so even in spite of a very bloody civil war in the 1860s. European revolutions seemed intent on destroying society and religion. Visitors to the United States quickly found that these impulses were almost non-existent among Americans. Indeed, Alexis de Tocqueville credited Americans' respect for religion, as he called it, as he said, quote, the greatest guarantee of the state's stability and the safety of individuals. They could have instituted the boldest of the political doctrines of the 18th century philosophers. There's no other country where they could have been instituted better, he said, but they did not. They came up to a point and stopped. Consideration of the American founding, then, I think, is best divided into 2 broad schools of thought. Chesterton laid out the first of these when he toured the United States in 1921 and again in 1930. He brought with him his sensibilities as both an Englishman and as a Catholic, officially joining the Catholic Church 1 year after his first visit. Like Charles Dickens and Lord Acton before him, he wrote about his time in America. In fact, he wrote 1 book for each trip. He wrote What I Saw in America in 1922, and he wrote a book called Sidelights on New London and Newer York in 1932. And along with these came the many columns he wrote during his visits for the Illustrated London News. And I suppose here is where I give a shout out to Aquinas College and their faculty research grants, because that allowed me to buy most of the collected works of Chesterton so I could work on the book and read through the Illustrated London News like this in a book rather than some kind of microfilm thing like the good old days, which weren't so good. I prefer the book to microfilm. I prefer anything to microfilm, I think. And what I saw in America, Chesterton wrote, America is the only nation in the world that is founded on a creed. That creed is set forward with dogmatic and even theological lucidity in the Declaration of Independence. Perhaps the only piece of practical politics that is also theoretical politics and also great literature. It enunciates that all men are equal in their claim to justice, that government exists to give them that justice, and that their authority for that reason is just. It certainly does condemn anarchism, and it does also, by inference, condemn atheism, since it clearly names the Creator as the ultimate authority from whom these equal rights are derived. So America, according to Chesterton, had a founding. That is a well-documented moment in time wherein a nation was created. And that founding, Chesterton argued, occurred on the basis of very specific ideas about justice and about equality and about the human person. John Courtney Murray agreed with Chesterton about what the Jesuit called the American proposition. That's what he called it. He argued, and we hold these truths, that, quote, the American proposition rests on the forthright assertion of a realist epistemology, end quote. I should leave it at that. That's clear as a bell, right? Should we just break for the cookies? In other words, universal truths about mankind that are discernible through reason form the foundation of American society and government. What John Paul later in his 1995 Camden Yards address, homily, referred to as the truth that can be known by reason and can therefore form the basis of a profound and universal dialogue. How different this is than a culture and society rooted in positivistic hypotheses, utilitarian calculations, idyllic dreams, utopian visions, that sort of thing, ideological claims. If this assertion is denied, wrote Murray in 1960, the American proposition is, I think, eviscerated at one stroke, end quote. Francis Cardinal George, who himself spoke at Aquinas College quite a few years ago. In fact, I recall talking to him after his talk here. And we were talking about Catholic liberal arts education, and back at that time I was saying, do you think we could have one here? And he said, well, if not here, then where else? So we talked about Catholic studies, and he said, it seems like a good idea. So anyway, we'll get a blurb from him if we could, but it's too late. But he was, in some ways, the inspiration for the renewal that Catholic studies was attempting to spark, just merely by a conversation with him afterwards. Some people are like this, I think. Now the however part. Francis Cardinal George criticizes Murray for too strictly separating religion and politics. Murray says George, quoting Murray, sees the two phrases of the First Amendment not as articles of faith, but as articles of peace. And therein lies the problem. They're political, not theological. And in Murray's mind, according to George, this means that they make no claims on Catholics who in any case are called to transform any culture in which they live. This, writes George, is a neo-scholastic two-tiered conception of nature and grace straight out of the Suarezian Jesuit tradition, end quote. Forgive me, President Quinn, I don't think he means Jesuit as a compliment there, but it's the Suarezian part, really, more than that. George thinks it is too sharp, he says, in its, quote, delineation between the natural and the supernatural. So if such a bald demarcation is true of the American founding, then I think George is right to argue that this would undermine freedom and produce what St. John Paul called the culture of death. Quote, without correlation to truths, quoting George, without correlation to truths rooted in nature and in God, George argues, echoing John Paul, human freedom becomes license, or alternatively, acquiesces in state tyranny. Well, where George sees rupture, Murray sees development. Murray argues that Americans of the founding era did believe in a transcendent order and in the existence of knowable truths. Once known, these truths could be integrated into society so that men might, quoting Murray, dwell in dignity, peace, unity, justice, well-being, and freedom, end quote. Indeed, they were already doing so by the 1760s. Between 1775 and 1783, students should start taking notes now, right? This is going to be in class probably. Some of my students are right. I swear I didn't bribe them with cookies or anything. They wanted a twofer today. And between 1775 and 1783, Americans fought a revolution to preserve this free society in the face of a creeping tyranny. These truths about the human person buttressed American society. They gave it dynamism, not only as a republic, but more importantly, as a republic of Christians who believed in popular sovereignty precisely because they were Christians. Americans, Murray said, assumed that citizens could live a life of reason, exercise their birthright in freedom, and assume responsibility for public affairs. And so consequently, they founded a limited national government meant only to promote the conditions necessary for peace, justice, and prosperity so that the real work of mankind, what he calls the spiritual task of knowing, loving, and serving God, might go ahead. Murray acknowledged Catholic condemnations of aspects of American political theory, but he argued that the condemnations applied to, quote, the type of government based on radically rationalist principles that emerged from the French Revolution. A condemnation of the American idea is implied only because there has been an official failure to take explicit account of the fact that the American political system and its institutions are not of revolutionary and Jacobin inspiration, end quote. Like Tocqueville before him, then, Murray wisely discerned the crucial difference between the American and French revolutions. Unfortunately, 19th century Catholic leaders, including some popes, did not always do so. Catholic social teaching, as it has developed since Rerum Novarum, however, has done so, as I try to show in the book. There are scholars like Murray and Chesterton who accept the existence of an American founding, but they disagree with them over its nature. Instead, they argue that, yeah, it was a hard founding, but it was one based almost entirely on Enlightenment principles in the ways that the First French Revolution was. The best current example of this is Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed. Deneen calls the United States, quote, the first nation founded by the explicit embrace of liberal philosophy, whose citizenry is shaped almost entirely by its commitment and its vision, end quote. He argues that the liberalism promoted by the founders, quote, above all advances a new understanding of liberty, end quote. The old definition of liberty, rooted in Greece and Rome and Christendom, relied on individual virtue in search of the common good. This ancient definition was thrust aside by the unholy trinity of Thomas Hobbes, Francis Bacon, and John Locke. For one steeped in radical self-interest and appetite, that is just desire. Culture contains the customs and traditions that limit individuals' appetite, so it would need to be destroyed. Even nature's limits would need to be overcome. Autonomous individuals are unlikely to love their own place, for their place might be what is stifling their autonomy. As the autonomous individual does not want to kneel before the past, neither does he want to be mindful of the future. His is an eternal present where the state guarantees fulfillment of his wildest desires, even when those desires are unnatural, unwise, or both. And in the end, according to Deneen, only a strong and centralized state can make this kind of libertine life possible. I think that's a fair presentation of Deneen. I'm sure somebody will correct me if I'm wrong. This is the liberalism, says Deneen, the creed, as it were, that was, quote, first instantiated as a political experiment by the founders of the American liberal republic. That is what he says, then, that the American experiment is. And because this liberalism was based on a false anthropology, a falsehood about what the human person is, a false anthropology of radical human autonomy, and not on the same Christian anthropology that gave birth to concepts like liberty and virtue in the first place, the American experiment was doomed to fail. The liberated individual, he writes, would require the controlling state to fulfill his passions or confirm him in his passivity, all the while chipping away at liberalism's foundations, so that the founders unwisely took for granted the continuation of all those things liberalism is designed to destroy: the health and continuity of families, schools, and communities. Deneen, I think, is at his best in his explanation of modernity and in his insightful comparison of what he calls America's liberal conservatives and America's conservative liberals. But his telling of the founding is not the fulsome and complex history of human events. As Samuel Goldman argues in his critique of why liberalism failed, there's an ahistorical argument of inevitability when we attribute profound social and political changes to arguments and philosophical treatises. You know, professors might think philosophical treatises are important, and they are to the 0.5% of the population that has read them over the long haul. And these things do have a trickle-down or trickle-up effect. But inevitability is a tough thing to argue about history. And I don't know about the other historians here, but I discourage talk of inevitability, whether it's the winning of wars or anything else. Taxes and death, I guess, right? We got us there. As Goldman puts it, it may be true that the philosophical currents that Deneen traces back to Bacon were necessary conditions for the American founding, but they were neither sufficient nor determinative. So in only acknowledging those intellectual factors, we risk, Goldman says, a kind of inverted Whig history. The Whigs were those English historians who argued that the Glorious Revolution, overthrowing their rightful monarch, Parliament placing a king upon the throne, etc., that was just part of human progress, a natural growth of liberty. And this progress would include a number of other things, including oppression of Catholics and decimation of the Irish and everything else. This was just England on its way up. Inevitable progress. That's Whig history. What Goldman is saying is that by acknowledging only intellectual factors, Deneen finds decline and corruption where liberals expected progress. Such ahistorical analysis, I argue, neglects the important ways in which the American Republic was not founded at all, and the ways in which its classical republicanism and diversity of Christians have shaped and continue to transform its culture. As long as America's Christian culture and civic republicanism tempered the individualistic and status excesses of liberalism, it would be hard to find a place that has been friendlier to a rightly ordered liberty. Which leads us to the second main school of thought we must consider if we're going to assess the compatibility of the American experiment with Catholicism. One that is neither as ahistorical and theory-driven as Deneen's in its condemnation of American democracy, nor as committed to the idea of a hard founding as Murray's is when he's praising American democracy. Russell Kirk is the best example of this second school of thought, which rejects the idea of a hard American founding. Kirk believed that the United States was exceptional and that it had a mission. This mission, he said, was no programmatic quest for a utopia based on the passing ideology of an age. Rather, it was a mission to see if a self-governed people could balance liberty with order, under law and to the maximization of justice. Justice, order, and freedom, Kirk claimed, are what he called the cardinal ideas that dominated the minds of the founders of the Republic. So that Kirk held America was not a new creation born of Enlightenment liberalism, the kind of liberalism Deneen identifies, and that if it were true, I think he'd be right. Rather, it was the preservation of a complex, long-developed civilization rooted in London, yes, but also in the political, philosophical, and moral traditions of Athens, Jerusalem, and Rome. In essence, Americans engaged in a revolution not to promote radical ideologies or to defend universal egalitarian claims, though a few had, but to preserve their traditional liberties. Good order in such a society would rely more on virtue and tradition than on state power. For Americans already knew too well how easily the power of a state or a state church could be abused. So what's the next step? The next step was for Americans to codify their order in a constitution to preserve and perpetuate a judicious balance between liberty and order. There's little in the order codified in the Constitution that is intrinsically opposed to Catholic social teaching. Were the Constitution not a compromise made by people with a Christian worldview, recognizing the importance of virtue, but rather an ideological blueprint based on a faulty anthropology of radical individual autonomy, this would not be the case. A country based on a creed can have a faulty creed capable of bringing down the whole machine if the creed is not in accord with human nature. Communism is the most obvious example, which is why state socialism remains the only system condemned by the magisterial teaching of the Catholic Church. A country speaking in creedal terms and the classical vocabulary of virtue, but rooted in its own long experience with liberty, can make do with an imperfect but best possible polity. I think that's the world most grown-ups live in. It's an imperfect one. It's the one we have. The United States was no less than a genuine development of Christian and Western civilization, and specifically of English civilization. Trace the antecedents. It isn't born overnight and created out of whole cloth. Combined their own lived experience as a free and religious people with English common law traditions, English constitutionalism, and to their English legacy, says Kirk, the founders of our republic added Roman features. These are all things I explore at length in particular chapters in the book, little though it is, particularly the common law aspect and the English constitutional aspect. The government of the city of man is going to do the minimum necessary to preserve order in that constitution, while the city of God would be left to transform culture and society. In such a culture, Catholics could no doubt, in St. John Paul II's words, provide a Christian witness, drawing out the full meaning of its noblest intentions. Tocqueville, a Catholic, noted that Catholics in America were fervent believers and practitioners of their religion at the same time that they were, and Dr. Duncan knows this well, the most Republican and Democratic class. Right? Title of your dissertation, I recall. In my opinion, writes Tocqueville, it would be wrong to see the Catholic religion as a natural opponent of democracy. Catholicism seems to me, on the contrary, to be one of the most supportive of the equality of social conditions. It makes no compromise with anyone and applies the same standard to each person. It likes to blend all social classes at the foot of the same altar. This is true even to the extent, as I write about in Missionaries of Republicanism, when American soldiers who were almost all Protestant went to Mexico. One of the things that surprised them was the way the wealthy in Mexico and the poor in Mexico all knelt on the floor before the altar, and they didn't have their own pew. There were no pew rentals in Mexico. Well, let's face it, there were no pews, but there was also no front rentals either of the front of the church. And this was just kind of stunning for the American soldiers. They'd never seen such a thing. The idea of a rich and poor sort of mingling in church and even in the same area and on their knees. So Catholicism might look like monarchy, said Tocqueville, but remove, he says, quote, the prince and the conditions are more equal than in republics. Once the priests are not part of government, they and their flock are the most likely to carry their beliefs into practice. Catholics, in short, he says, quote, are the most obedient believers and the most independent citizens, end quote. Tocqueville was Catholic. Perhaps he's biased, but it's worth listening to. Is the American experiment then so intrinsically incompatible with the Catholic faith that Catholics should wash their hands of it and shake the dust from their feet? Is redeeming the time, to quote St. Paul, a waste of time for Catholic Americans? The Catholic English historian Christopher Dawson, whose program for the study of Christian culture forms the basis of the Catholic Studies program here at Aquinas College, Christopher Dawson did not think so. Despite the pressure of secularization, he wrote in 1961, at the same time, America still possesses the priceless advantages of educational and intellectual freedom, so that we are still free to work and plan for the restoration of Christian culture, end quote. America, Dawson believed, held what he called, quoting again, the best prospect for the development of a Catholic culture. Why? Because he said the combination of freedom, democracy, and a much richer cultural inheritance than anything that American Protestants knew, end quote. Catholics were uniquely poised, he said, to engage their nation's norms without capitulating to currently prevalent secularism. As Adam Schwartz points out, after World War II, a whole host of English authors and critics were condemnatory of American culture, ranging from J.R.R. Tolkien to Graham Greene. Dr. Davis, you're teaching a class on Tolkien right now for Catholic Studies, aren't you? The Silmarillion. I just finished the Treebeard chapter last night in the Two Towers. Good stuff. I think Tolkien gets Treebeard right. I think this he got a little wrong. That Dawson, writes Schwartz, was willing to break with these traditions, this tradition of just being horrified, of English Catholic intellectuals being horrified by American culture, shows, as Chesterton's similar willingness had, the extent of his faith in Catholicism's transformative power. In the other direction, I would add, lies despair at the end of the road eventually. America, said G.K. Chesterton rightly, is indeed beholden to some big ideas, ideas that have been elaborated upon or abused or rejected over the past 240 years. But I think this is not the same as a founding. If by founding we mean a fashioning out of whole cloth a new nation based on liberal democracy as defined by a small group of men, detached from history, and completely shaped by those Enlightenment ideals contrary to the classical and Christian heritage of Western civilization. American ideas of human freedom tended to be rooted in the Christian worldview of the human person as intrinsically dignified with the right to life and liberty. America may be a country with a creed, as Chesterton said, but it wasn't as much more than that. And as it turns out, Chesterton noticed this too. Is there anything this guy did not notice? The answer is no, not as far as I've been able to tell. Quote, "The real quality of America is much more subtle and complex than this. And it's mixed not only of good and bad, and rational and mystical, but also of old and new. This is what makes the task of tracing the true proportions of American life so interesting and so impossible." Chesterton then, as did Russell Kirk later, recognized that the best America was the one that Americans had built better than they knew. This was no creedal country in the sense of having an ideological blueprint, wherein if there was some anthropological error in the blueprint, the whole edifice would crumble. This was the fruit of human experience, for good and ill, with both great promise and potential peril, and Chesterton noted as much. He said, "So far as that democracy becomes or remains Catholic and Christian, that democracy will remain democratic. Insofar as it does not, it will become wildly and wickedly undemocratic. Its rich will riot with brutal indifference far beyond the feeble feudalism which retains some shadow of responsibility or at least of patronage. Its wage slaves will either sink into heathen slavery or seek relief in theories that are destructive not only in method but in aim, since they are but negations of the human appetites of property and personality. 18th century ideals formulated in 18th century language have no longer in themselves the power to hold all these pagan passions back. Even those documents depended upon deism," says Chesterton. "Men will more and more realize that there is no meaning in democracy if there is no meaning in anything, and that there is no meaning in anything if the universe has not a center of significance and an authority that is the author of our rights." In this sense, then, backing up from Chesterton, in this sense, the creed turns out to be a creed, but not really a particularly 18th century English one, nor an ideological dogma, at least at its roots. Its foundation, again, lies in the classical and Christian heritage of the West. The ancients and medievals are not poster children for authentic self-government, the practice of virtue, the proper exercise of liberty, and the balance of the individual with the community, even if the best among them promoted these ideas. We ought not be too nostalgic for their age. We certainly would not say that Roman Catholicism is incompatible with monarchy or aristocracy because of the failure of monarchs, any more than we would argue that Roman Catholicism is incompatible with the papacy due to the grim machinations and personal infidelities of certain popes. Again, CST, Catholic social teaching, holds that the coming of the kingdom of God cannot be discerned in the perspective of a determined and definitive social, economic, or political organization. It does not, in John Paul II's words, imprison changing socio-political realities in a rigid schema, but instead recognizes that human life is realized in history, in conditions that are diverse and imperfect. Meanwhile, the Church affirms the dignity of the human person while respecting his freedom, which is no easy task, I think. So was the United States built on a creed? Yes, in a sense, but creeds are symbols of deeper beliefs, and the American creed was never an ideology pregnant with inevitable failure. Chesterton recognized this, as did St. John Paul II. Catholic critics of American democracy should recognize it as well, so the people of goodwill might redeem the time in a manner suited to our time. Thank you. We always at Catholic Studies events have question and answers. Well, we always have questions. And so I think there will be, we have a microphone that's traveling around, and we have a couple of microphones here. We're going to have time for a few questions, and then you could break for the cookies and fellowship and writing of checks to Catholic studies and that kind of thing.
If you prefer not to stand, you can just raise your hand and I'll run this microphone over to you.
Thank you, Professor Pinheiro. Simple question. Is American democracy compatible with a Catholic worldview? And then for that matter, is any political system compatible with a Catholic worldview? That's the question.
Well, that was kind of my question about what do we mean by compatible, right? Perfectly compatible, I don't see how it could be. We're also on very difficult times in the United States. Pope Benedict XVI was, importantly, it talked about the dangers of thinking you can arrive at truth through democracy. If you can imagine arriving at the truth of things merely by us kind of deciding and the majority wins, this is a difficult thing, right? Is it compatible? I would say absolutely that a Catholic, I do this every day. I live in the United States, and I try to transform it by transforming myself, by undergoing constant conversion, and compatible in that extent. And I don't think that means that the Catholic Church has to approve each and everything done by the Democratic majority in the country or our representatives. I think as John Paul said, sometimes it means condemning your culture and seeking to transform it. But at the same time, for Americans, I think, after I take a look at the founding, that at the same time always means trying to draw out what's best in it. And a lot of what's best, I think, as John Paul identified, was quoted both by Lincoln and coined by Jefferson. And just the recognition of the transcendent value of the human person and what makes people equal, having the same Father, who Jefferson called nature's God, but we have another name for him as Catholics, right? Or at least titles. Go from the philosopher to the theologian over here.
Outstanding reflections, John. May even get me out of despair in the current situation, but who knows?
Did you say
the question I have is, how do we get in the mess that we've gotten into? If we have this American creed, and you see it in the Declaration of Independence, you indicate that the Constitution is compatible with that in many ways. How did we lose the part of the cultural heritage which the tradition had brought to the American experience? I don't think there's an answer to this, but how are we in the mess we're in today?
People always ask historians this after we point out these things, and they're like, well, how do we fix it? And if I knew how to fix it, I probably wouldn't be here tonight, But I have a few answers for that. I think the important thing, so you said the Constitution, there's nothing intrinsically in there that's contrary, is what I said. I think that's different than compatibility or promotive of, right? So there's nothing intrinsically to forestall those elements of Catholic social teaching. In fact, it seems in the what's at the head of the organic law of the United States, the Declaration of Independence, is a recognition right there at the head of the organic law of the United States in the Declaration of this idea of human equality. And it doesn't take much of a study of American history to know that Americans, like every other person, every other nation on earth, has not done a great job with that. But we've talked about it a lot. But it's the abolitionists in the 1830s who were quoting Thomas Jefferson and the pro-slavery people who are arguing against his words. It's Martin Luther King who's quoting Thomas Jefferson in the 1950s and 60s. So, one's ideas and one's behavior are not always one and the same. We'd like them to be most of us, but at least for Catholics, that's why we have confession, right? Where does this all start to go wrong? So Deneen says it's in the Constitution, right? I don't think it's in the Constitution. I don't think it's in the founding. I think 230 years is already a pretty good run, to be frank, for any civilization or republic or single constitutional order. So we ought not be so negative of the difficulties. I guess I would. I'm sorry for those of you who are of a particular age here, but I guess I'd probably have to blame the generation that came of age in the 1960s for some things, if you wanted the truth, Bob. But it's not any group's fault in the sense that they're latching on to trends in the 1960s that were not brand new, that had been long in growth, things that are going to result in the devastation caused by the sexual revolution, for example, things that are going to promote radical individual autonomy in ways that Aristotle would have just said, what, nature tells us we're community beings, but you want to tell me, what, did you give birth to yourself? Did you create yourself? Where did you come from? I mean, nature itself tells us we're creatures of community, or a creature of the polis, I think is how he put it, right? Political animals is how that's usually translated. So I wish I had all the solutions. I'd have a consulting firm, savetheworld.org or something, but I don't. But I think what I try to do in the book is simply remind people, without even saying this explicitly, that not only is despair a deadly sin, there's lots of reasons why despair is a deadly sin. And, Rome was not an easy place to live for Christians prior to 313, but somehow the Catholic Church flourished. Was Catholicism compatible with the Roman tyranny? I don't think so. But 1,000 years later, as Christopher Dawson and others wrote, it had managed to transform the culture of death for entertainment and slavery into the Christendom of Dante and Thomas Aquinas. Professor?
So we've had the philosopher and the theologian, now a historical
Now the historian.
question. So
Yes.
I really appreciate your tour de force presentation, and particularly your integration of historical themes in the background. But clearly a lot of the focus is on this Lockean tradition and the Enlightenment tradition. But in terms of the genius of our political order, how much of it, and in your book, how much do you explore more the structural side, particularly with the separation of powers and really the Roman precedent, and really more the Republican side of the Constitution as opposed to the Democratic side, which everyone, of course, was always deeply, democracy, of course, never really
Not
had
good.
never had a very good reputation. So more on the Montesquieu and the Polybius and just the Roman structure as opposed to Thomas Jefferson and Locke.
The book is part of the Christian Social Thought series, which is an ecumenical series published by the Acton Institute. It's very thin. I would call it, after writing the other books I wrote, this is a long essay, in a lot of ways. And so I spend much more time on tracing the Declaration and showing it to be the fruit of the common law tradition, and showing religious liberty to be the fruit of lived human experience, as opposed to the fruit of somebody saying, it'd be a great idea as if we had religious liberty. Let's try this. Kind of the communist approach. Here's our blueprint. Let's do this. It looks great. I think it'll work. I think it'll work. And then it doesn't work. As the structural, no, not so much. But I do point to places to go in the book. But the goal here is to look at the Constitution as codifying something already in existence, but not creating something new based on, again, ideology. So in that sense, explicit in the book is the United States is part of the development of at least the moral and political traditions and legal traditions, is part of the fruit of English civilization, which is part of the fruit of Western civilization, which is, of course, Christendom, which traces its roots back into Athens and Rome. So yeah, I was supposed to write a book on all of just the whole, like, America and its compatibility. I couldn't get out of the founding period. This was a problem. So when I turned the book and I said, guess what I've written? I've written a book on the founders. I hope that's okay. So they had a larger work would cover what you said, and the book would be the first chapter, probably, right?
You said that you don't think America was inevitably a failure. Does that mean that it cannot fail?
Oh,
and
no.
What does it mean?
No, that's not what I mean to say. So in other words, it's not inevitably doomed to fail because in the very beginning there's these few ideas that unwinded over time and infected everybody, and now we just kind of have to wait for the full. That's what I mean. I don't mean to say that American civilization will last forever until the second coming.
Right. And so what does it mean then for the experiment to fail when it does? How will we know that the experiment has failed?
Yeah, I don't know. You know, on a bad day, I think it has, right? I just don't think it was inevitable. But that's, I mean, that's a great question. How would we know? Boy, I'll have to think about that. What are the signs of the times, and how do we read them? The fact that you and I can argue about this is maybe a sign it hasn't failed. The fact that you can get several 100,000 in the streets of Washington, D.C. to protest the legalized killing of the unborn and other human beings, is that a sign it's failed and they're complaining about it, or is that a sign it hasn't failed? I don't know. I mean, even that could be a sign of which way do you want to pick on that one, right? So the complexity of the question is a good one. I appreciate the question. Yeah.
Dr. Pinheiro, thanks so much. Really appreciate this.
You're welcome. And thanks, Campus Ministry, for providing the goodies tonight.
Well, thank you for providing the keynote for our St. Thomas Aquinas Week lecture. I have a question for you here. When you were speaking of American democracy giving voice to every citizen, every person in equal manner, this also offers people an opportunity for a self-determination notion and individualism. And our nation, in many ways, was founded with an ethos of self-determination, individualism, that rugged American individualism that is different than perhaps the communal celebration and the communal salvation, both politically and eternally, that is present in Catholicism and in different types of government. I'm wondering, how do you reconcile those two, where you have a vote that gives a voice, but also you have an individualism rather than a communalism present in Catholicism?
I think, that is the task that John Paul said was so difficult. How do you get, freedom, but freedom and truth? And how do you propose but not impose the truth? This phrase he was often fond of using about proposing but not imposing. I mean, how do you do that? So to argue that we didn't have a founding in the way some people think there was, and that there are things in the American political tradition intrinsically opposed to Catholic social teaching, that doesn't mean Catholics in American culture over the last couple hundred years have not had their difficulties, and other groups for that matter. I mean, I talk a lot in the book about religious freedom, because this seems to be the one American gift to the Church Universal, in the sense of showing that this can be done. Now, we do have religious indifference, but we have religious indifference in a lot of places in the world. We have less religious indifference in the United States in some ways, although we tend to think about the nuns, not the sisters, but the NONES, right? We tend to think about those folks when we measure religious belief in the United States and how many young people claim they're spiritual and not religious and that sort of thing. But compared to many other countries, particularly those that were actually part of Christendom, which doesn't include the United States, things are much more dismal there, I think. So that is simply, Robert, you've landed on the one central point of tension. How do you do this in a democracy? I think this was Gregory XVI's worry and Pius IX's worry, that democracy makes this even harder. But somehow, since Leo XIII, and especially with John Paul II, Dignitas Humanae, they seem to be saying democracy actually produces subsidiarity, and somehow it's a good thing. And how do we honor people's freedom at the same time we're trying to tell them not to choose wrongly? But you can't make somebody choose rightly. So we can't sin if we're not free, but we can't really do good if we're not free either. That's the best I got for you. Okay. One more or no more? I think that's probably enough. Sister down here.
Thanks, John. This was
Yes.
a marvelous lecture.
Thank you.
I don't have a question for you. I just have something that I'm wrestling with, and that is the concept of justice that seemed to be a part of the foundation, and what that justice is based on. You mentioned order and freedom and dignity and those kinds of things, but when I think of Catholicism, I tend to think of it relationally, communally, etc. And so as I'm looking at justice, which is based on principles, I guess that's the area of fruitfulness for my own thought as I wrestle with this a little bit more in
Okay.
terms of compatibility or whatever.
And so, again, even thinking of the Constitution, which of course allows for the constitutionality of slavery, right? I mean, the Constitution has to be amended, speaking of justice and injustice, to each his due is, I think, the simplest, best definition of justice ever given that I know. I mean, to start at that point, right? And what does that mean? So we have those struggles on the one hand, right, of justice and injustice. And then we have what's identified in one of the books I use in my classes here. There's a comparison, let's say, of this is the first comparison that comes to mind, so I use it, but it's about governmental policy towards land, towards real estate, towards the availability of land. And the difficulty, so in the United States, the government just kind of got out of the way prior to the 1860s, and after that, it engaged in getting Indians out of the way so that American citizens could settle on their territory. And so from the American citizen standpoint, this is their road to liberty and justice, they think. Nowhere else in the world is there the widespread availability of cheap land where a person, if they work, can earn not a living, but just a life, just live the good life. And you couldn't do that in Australia or New Zealand or some of the other places settled by the English because of the laws there. It just was not that easy, in other words. Regulation, bureaucracy, etc. The U.S. government, at least in the 19th century, does a pretty good job of just kind of getting out of the way. But then there's these other issues of justice, as I mentioned. But merely by getting out of the way can sometimes allow to, if I work hard, and there's not a drought, etc. I mean, this ends up being the problem that we cover in American history, right? But these are the two great injustices. The organic sins, as Paul Johnson, the historian, calls them, of American history. That is the treatment of the indigenous, and then slavery, of course. But what I hope to have tried to show is that those are human behaviors, and they're not uniquely American. Displacing some people for others. I get liberty by taking away your liberty. Slavery, for instance, one of the oldest human institutions practiced on nearly every continent and culture at some point or another in some form. So then we start looking for the distinctive things, or that group of people that are calling Americans to something better and to something more, and they're using specifically, both in the abolitionist movement and in the civil rights movement, Christian arguments in the name of justice. Martin Luther King from a Birmingham jail is quoting St. Augustine, and again, one last mention, Thomas Aquinas, right, among others, from that letter from the Birmingham jail. And they're quoting them about how do you know when a law is just or unjust. And an unjust law, he says, is no law at all, not according to Thomas, as I understand him to be saying. So we're not a country free of sin, and I'm not here to preach, an overweening jingoistic love of the American body politic, right? Just taking a look at the founding and the Declaration and the Constitution and wondering if it was all doomed to fail, and if the Protestant nativists were right all along, that Catholicism is inimical to republicanism, or in our parlance, incompatible with democracy, and I don't think so. And I think the compendium just seems pretty clear on that to me. And as a mere layperson, I find things like the compendium very helpful. So, thank you.